It's so interesting, and it's something that comes up all the time when somebody says, I'm going to start following a paleo diet. I'm going to eat what our ancestors ate. So I'm going to eat a lot of meat and vegetables." And I cringe a little bit when I hear that, because I'm like, I don't think they ate a ton of vegetables. I think most of the things you walk into the produce aisle and see as vegetables probably were not around even a few hundred years ago, let alone through our evolution.
No question about that. It's so funny that people think, like paleo man was out picking broccoli all day. Paleo woman was like not into broccoli because it didn't exist. And most, really it's been the last 400 years where we've really been developing more and more varieties of things. I know in Peru, it took them a long time to develop hundreds and hundreds of varieties of potatoes. But even getting Westerners to bother with potatoes, and they didn't bring the clay technology with them and say we should soak them in clay and make them safer to eat. People were not initially very receptive to the potato because by itself, it's pretty bland and boring. And so they thought of it as livestock feed, right? So depending on what kind of land you had, a potato might be appropriate use of your land, and you could feed it to your pigs and then have pork and milk and stuff that you wanted. So it took a while for us to adopt these things, and often there's some kind of real cultural pressure for it to have to do these. But then in the meantime, we keep inventing, like the original tomatoes, my understanding were, the size of a giant raspberry, and they were hard and dark and bitter and not very interesting food. But now we have heirloom tomatoes, hundreds of quote heirloom tomatoes, but they're all human inventions. Corn is a human invention, and you couldn't have a giant ear of corn that doesn't spread its seeds on itself in nature. I mean, birds help a lot with seed spreading, grant you that, but it takes a lot of work for the squirrels and birds to spread corn seeds around. So much of the food we think is, we must have, this is normal food. Because in our short lives, in our short history of knowing grandma's dinner and mom's dinner and ours, we have no perspective of the million of years of history of human eating. And paleo is a great concept, right? But then everybody comes up with cookbooks that says paleo man needed almond muffins and almond pancakes with chocolate sauce.
Ridiculous.
Erythritol.
That's just absolutely. I don't remember that in the cave paintings. Almond flour. Like, did they paint with that? It's such a bizarre story. How we got to this place of thinking all these things are healthy for us when, for a lot of people, they cause a lot of harm. And again, it's all the superfoods. It's everything that you talk about in your upcoming book. And so I'm wondering if we can maybe now talk about what exactly are oxalates for people that are wondering. And I would really love to explore, like, why do plants make them? What purpose do they serve? Because they do a lot of good for the plant. And the plant, like we talked about last time, plants are not around just for us to like enjoy and eat and chop, and get rid of all the time. Like, they're there for their own reason.
Yeah, and they're very useful to us just being there because they create the air we're breathing. Like, really important. Without them, we're in trouble, right? And that's, part of the solution right now is like plant more trees and do this stuff because they're such an important part of the ecosystem. And we've misinterpreted them as just wanting to feed us. In modern lore, I mean, if you were to eat this plant right here, this is not going to be a good meal. And that's everyone right. knows if your child were eating this plant, which is really lovely, aglaonema, your kid is going to get sick. And it might be so sick that you might end up in the emergency room. Remember, berries on the bushes. This is not, plants are, very few of them out in nature are edible. The ones that are edible, we have had to create and nurture and play with, and then do things like soak them in clay and so on, and use particular parts in particular ways. And we've lost sight of that. And you can see that in this recent disaster with this vegan lentil thing that has been making people sick. That is exactly what we're talking about, where this product has not prepared lentils in a traditional way. And the way they're asking people to cook it at home is completely a new way to handle lentils. And then the way that's being delivered, prepared, and consumed makes it quite toxic, and people are getting in trouble eating that. So
is this a specific thing? I wasn't aware of this. Was the lentil thing is a specific problem right now?
Yes, there's a product. There's a vegan product. I've forgotten the name of it, but it's been in the news the last couple of weeks of people getting quite sick on this vegan lentil crumbles. And
Wow.
lentils are very high in a different compound. They're not very high in oxalate. And I will get back to your question, like, why do plants need oxalate and oxalic acid? We'll get to that. But just to finish up the lentil piece, lentils are very high in lectins. Lectin is a family of gigantic proteins that bind to carbohydrates, and there's little carbohydrate molecules on cells. So they bind to cells and they kind of ruin cells and cause a lot of problems. And they're basically, gluten is an example of a lectin molecule that, again, can get you into trouble and start destroying your digestive system, and can even get into tissues like your brain and start connecting to cells. And so lectins are bad news. That's why my slow cooking of the beans was so bad for me, because by slow cooking those beans, those lectin proteins were not getting denatured. You need very high heat. You need to stimulate those beans, like lentils, into a sort of germination state where their physiology is shifting, and then nail them with really high heat. And in India, they know they always use a pressure cooker when they cook their lentils and beans. But whatever they're doing in this company producing this lentil product, they're not using water-based, pressure cooked, and they're not soaking them and germinating them and dealing with the lectin problem and whatever other compounds are in there. And then a person is to fry this prepared in oil at home. None of that is,
oh my God,
traditional preparation. So it's messing up people, giving them intestinal
wow.
problems. And
wow. Well, thank you for that explanation. I was not aware of that. That's insane.
yeah. And I feel bad for anybody, because my use of slow cooked beans gave me a very bad case of irritable bowel syndrome, where I would be doubled over in pain, wondering if I should die. I remember being on the bathroom floor. And then one time I was trying to drive back home from the gym, and I had to pull to a side street and wait for 10 minutes for the cramps to stop so I could safely drive.
Wow.
Yeah.
Serious.
And I didn't realize any of this until fairly recently. I was, still in my 20s when that was happening. And that's thanks to my vegan diet.
Wow.
And, I'm almost 60 now at age 58. So that was a while ago.
Well, you look great.
Yeah. Luckily, if you're on the straight and narrow, like I've been, eating real foods instead of eating junk vegetarian foods, and I haven't been consuming seed oils and soybean oil. And I've been so strict about that for so long. I'm recovering from my oxalate problems and still look kind of put together.
You look very well put together.
Thank you.
It is amazing you can reverse that.
So I think that's another example of your nutritional history. If you've been on a lot of highly processed commercial foods that are devoid of nutrients and have toxic rancid oils in them, that makes the toxins, the natural toxins in plants, even more toxic, and even the recovery from that is probably also harder, because the amount of metabolic damage and cellular, your cell membranes have to be made of materials that you put in your body. And if you put the wrong fats in your cell membranes, all your physiology is affected by cell membrane capacities that are determined by what they're made of. And you got a lot of trans fats and bent fats and weird fatty acids in your cells, and you're not happy. It's same with oxalates running around, really messing up membranes and really causing cell death and inflammation. So I probably should go back to your question. Why do plants need oxalate?
Why do plants need oxalate?
Why do they need it? Well, they don't totally know. And the researchers have identified like 6 or 7 purposes for oxalate, oxalic acid. And then the plants make oxalic acid. In many cases, the physiology of plants seems to be make vitamin C first and then turn that into oxalic acid, which is interesting because vitamin C easily transforms itself into oxalic acid. It probably can do it in the pill itself, in the jar, in the food, but it definitely does it in our bodies. And a major source of oxalic acid, which becomes oxalate, which is the salt form that starts creating crystals in the body. The major form of oxalic acid that's called internal production is really coming from vitamin C. So you can overconsume vitamin C, definitely with supplements. And there's even a couple of studies that suggest overdoing C, even in natural fruits and vegetables, is pro-oxidative. And if you do it all the time, it creates oxidative stress. And that's probably because the vitamin C turns to oxalic acid in the body. That's where the oxidative problem comes from, is when you have high levels of vitamin C is directly pro-oxidative and anti-cancer because it's just cell murdering, and the cancer cells are more susceptible. So anyway, the plants need that oxalic acid because it helps them manage calcium. Some plants are really sensitive to too much calcium, like all of us, we need just the right amount of calcium in our cells, and soils are loaded with calcium. So when there's high calcium soil, the plants need more oxalic acid to manage that. In fact, with tomatoes, if it's high calcium soil and it's a very humid summer, the tomatoes will make so many oxalic acid crystals, this is calcium oxalate crystals, that they get these little yellow bumps on their, what they call the shoulders. The top curve of the tomato will have yellowing and little bumps, little like blisters. And those are the oxalic acid crystals kind of breaking up this other cells in the tissue. So those tomatoes don't keep well. They're not marketable. So it's a big problem if you have too much calcium and you have a humid summer, because the oxalate gets so much that it wrecks the tomato itself. So the tomato is trying to contain the damage that just free roaming calcium would do to them in that human environment. And by doing so, that still has side effects. So even crystals forming in the tomato is hurting the tomato. But it doesn't matter if you're a tomato, because your only purpose is to spread seeds for next year. So if the flesh is damaged, nature is not too worried about it. So you're going to manage your calcium, and trees will shed the calcium through the tree bark. Apparently, most of the soot that forms from burning wood is calcium oxalate coming off the bark. And the plants use these crystals. Also, plants deliberately construct crystals in many sets of specific shapes. And they do this by laying out a whole matrix or scaffolding with amino acids. And many amino acids are attractive to calcium. So calcium and oxalate will set up on these amino acids just so, and the plants know this and can build very deliberate shapes. One of the shapes they like to build is this double pointed arrow. It's like a toothpick, uber tiny, many hundreds of toothpicks in little bundles, like little, quivers, like 200 little arrows, and they're deliberately designed for defense. They can penetrate our mucous membrane cells 2 cells deep. These little arrows. Wow, and that's crazy. I've seen videos where the plant is deliberately shooting them out one at a time. So I tell people that plants build calcium oxalate crystals is part of the original invention of warfare. Like the spear was invented by plants. It's just so small, they never got credit for their cleverness.
Well, they're getting credit now.
They are. We love plants. I'm a great gardener. I'm a lover of trees. I have been my whole life, and I love flowers. I even just put a flower picture on my Instagram today because it's summer and my flowers are happy. And these plants, they're doing the ones that were in the shade. Like this is a shade plant. The ones that are house plants come from the tropics, and it's a shade plant. This shade plant gets along in this low light in the house, probably because it makes calcium oxalate, what I call disco balls. So these multi-sided, sort of really crazy, lots of little plates of oxalate in here allows the light that comes into the leaf to bounce around inside that cell. And every little bit of that photon of light gets used for energy. We're not wasting light because we're letting the light bounce all over the place, and the plant can use that energy. The other thing that they're saying, it's fascinating. It's so cool, and plants are fantastic. And one of the things they'll do is apparently, I think this is still they're still arguing a little bit about it, but the cactus and the desert plants make a ton of oxalate, and it seems that it's using calcium oxalate. Now, oxalate is a 2-carbon molecule. It's an organic molecule that has carbon in it, and plants breathe carbon, right? They breathe CO2. That's why they're good for this carbon sequestration thing, right? They breathe CO2 and they produce oxygen, but they do this breathing and producing of oxygen during the sun times. When the sun is out, that's when they're creating glucose and sugars and building and growing. Well, in the sun, in the desert, it's parched, man. This really dry. And the plants have this breathing hole on the bottom of the leaves called stoma. The stoma have to close in the hot heat, or else the plant would turn to crisp, right? So the stoma is closed. It can't breathe in the daytime. It can't get the CO2 from the air because it can't breathe. So what it uses is the oxalic acid, the 2-carbon oxalate, as a carbon source overnight. So during the day, it uses up oxalate, and during the night, it makes more oxalate. So the plants make oxalic acid crystals in order to be able to do photosynthesis in the desert in the dry periods when there's no rain and the air is crispy dry.
That's incredible. Wow.
There's like a whole bunch of uses. Another one is the leaves on plants will turn oxalic acid, release it as acid, and then turn that into hydrogen peroxide, which will kill funguses. So these arrows help kill insects and deter insects. Then you can kill funguses. And then you can kind of irritate the throat of people who dare to eat too many kiwis or too many something or other. So you're discouraging predation, you're killing off fungus, you're just living your life and protecting yourself, because there you are plopped in the ground. You don't have claws, except, you make thorns and you do all these, you do everything you can to say, look, don't eat me. But then you have this chemical system underneath that's supporting good physiology and self-defense.